Hey guys, what's up? And welcome back to Moan Inc. If you guys are new here, then what is up? My name is Erica. Heya, how you doing? And if you're into the history of the ancient Greeks and the Romans, maybe you're just into the mythology, and maybe you just saw my review of Daughters of Sparta, you really want to get into the Iliad, and you're like, oh my god, tell me more, Erica. Well, then this is not only the video for you, this is also the channel for you. You guys are going to want to hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so that you know every single time I post in the future. But on to the topic of today's video. As you can see from the title, I have a very, very special guest with me today who I'm so excited to speak to. I'll be speaking to the author of Daughters of Sparta, Claire Heywood. Now, you guys know I'm a massive fan of the Iliad. I'm a huge Homer nerd that's really, I think it's the military aspect of it and the fact that it's like a story with all the gods, and I live for it. I have a whole series on the Iliad, literally just that book alone, where I just nerd out, so you guys can watch that. But today I get to be talking to Claire, who was heavily influenced by the Iliad and by a lot of Greek mythology, different Greek mythology, in order to weave her story for Daughters of Sparta, which follows the story of Helen and Kyltemnestra, who most people, as I've said before, even me, forget that they are sisters, so she wanted to tell them together. However, today we're not going to be going into the whole story. So if you guys want to know the story of Daughters of Sparta and what the book is about, then you should definitely check out my video. I don't know what corner it pops up in. Really have to be more familiar with the YouTube at this point, you would think I was. The video is popping up at some point. The video is popping up, and you guys can definitely check that out if you want to know more about the book itself. But for today, Claire and I will be chatting about the mythology that inspired her, the stories that inspired her, and what exactly was driving her to write a sister's tale. So without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce Claire to the channel. So let's just roll into the video. So welcome, Claire, to Moan Inc. Thank you so much for sitting down and chatting with me, because it is Thursday. It's like the middle of the day on Thursday. I hope I didn't drag you out of anything.
No, I'm fine. I'm sort of between editing stages at the moment, so I'm all flexible.
Oh, how exciting. Of a new book?
Yeah, book 2.
Stop it. Oh my god. Okay, well, we can talk about that at the end off camera. Sorry guys, we're not including that for you. But why don't we start talking about your new book, which is Daughters of Sparta. And for the viewers who don't know, as I said at the beginning, you can watch my review of it. You can go and check out the Goodreads and everything like that. But we should talk about the main characters. So we've got Helen and Kyltemnestra, the two sisters, two very famous sisters in mythology. So what was your inspiration for telling this story as a duo, like telling them together as opposed to just focusing on Helen or just focusing on Clytemnestra?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because originally I sort of had this idea about a series of short stories about all sorts of women from myth, mostly the women that had a bit of a hard time of it in terms of their reputation, women that were vilified. So I had a bit of a short list of those, but it included Helen and Clytemnestra. And I realized that they're sisters, and yet their story never gets told in that way. And then I thought about it some more, and actually mythology is full of stories about brothers. And quite a few of those crop up in Daughters of Sparta. We find Castor and Pollux, and Agamemnon and Menelaus, and also Atreus and Thyestes. There's plenty of brother stories, and they're always told together. And yet sisters, it doesn't seem relevant that they're related. So I thought it was quite interesting. Maybe the ancient world just didn't think that bond was important, but to me, it's definitely a bond that's worth exploring. I've got a sister myself, so I was quite interested in writing about that relationship, and it's something that I felt I could understand. So that was the starting point.
So what ancient sources did you use then to draw from in your book, and which ones really helped, and were there some that were more helpful or less helpful?
Well, there was 2 major starting points, one for each of the sisters, I would say. When I was studying for my master's, I translated some Greek texts. One of those was Iliad Book 3, which you've noticed is an influence throughout the novel. And that was my starting point for Helen's character, really. Because it's the main point of the Iliad where we actually see her as a person, where she actually says things, and we get some of her interior life living in Troy. So that was, if you don't know Iliad Book 3, essentially she is in her chamber, weaving, and then someone comes along to tell her that Paris and Menelaus are going to have a duel over her to decide the war. They've decided that it's been enough years of fighting, they've lost a lot of men on both sides, and it would be better to just fight man to man and decide who gets to keep her. So that's the kind of setup of the book. But what I found most interesting was that Helen's immediate reaction to that news is she longs for home. She longs for Menelaus, her first husband. She doesn't care that she might be taken away from Paris. And throughout the Iliad, in fact, Helen's sort of feelings toward Paris are, I mean, at best lukewarm. She's pretty she's pretty disparaging of him and much more complimentary of Hector. And she says that she wishes she'd married a better man, you know. And I just thought, I can completely imagine that scenario in her head. You know, she's literally risked everything, given up everything, moved away from her home for a man that turns out to be a little disappointing, to say the least. So that was really my starting point for Helen, to take that moment of her in Troy feeling that way and look at how the hell she got there. And then for Clytemnestra, the text that influenced me most was Iphigenia in Aulis, which is probably unsurprising. I translated that as well, and just the amount of tragic emotion in that play. If you haven't read it, I recommend taking a look. But it is really one of the most tragic Greek tragedies that was ever written, in my opinion. And also just all of the different characters that are interplaying and their perspectives on what's happening. And a lot of the time it's dramatic irony, because one character thinks a certain situation is how it is, and yet other people know that that's not the truth. So again, that was my starting point for Clytemnestra's story, the kind of peak of her tragedy and what led up to that point, and then the aftermath of that point. But that was always in my head, the scene that I imagined that would be her kind of pinnacle.
Well, those are like two incredible scenes. Like Iliad Book 3 is one of my favorites, just because Helen is such a savage in the entire thing.
And it's interesting with the Iliad's portrayal of Helen as well. The Iliad was the first classical text that I ever read, obviously in translation. You know, I didn't know any Greek at the time. But one of the things that struck me was her response to Paris and her feelings about that relationship, because I feel like a lot of more modern retellings of that story romanticize it. You know, it is a love story. They're star-crossed lovers. It's very Romeo and Juliet. And then right to the bitter end of the war, they're still in love. They want to stay together, but it can't be, you know. And I just thought, that's not what Homer intended at all. You know, if you read the Iliad, no way is Helen happy with that situation.
I completely agree. I say that all the time. So I'm like, it's fine if you want to tell that story. Like, that's fine if you want it to be that way. But that's not the original story. That is not the woman that we get. That's not the relationship. She tells Paris to his face, I wish you were dead. Like, this is the woman that we're dealing with and the relationship that we're dealing with. And Paris just goes like, okay, fine. But I mean, you're here now. You might as well enjoy it. It's so comical. It's such a very like weird sort of way, considering it's a war and they're all going to die. And we know this from the start of the book. I'm not ruining anything for you. Just that everyone knows. That's actually one of the things I wanted to ask you though, was that with Menelaus and with Helen, because she marries Menelaus and then that's why she ends up being taken she goes with Paris, she gets taken by Paris, whichever way you want to tell it. But she ends up going there, and in that sort of way, a modern viewer is always saying that Menelaus is either the bad guy or Helen is the bad guy. It's either one or the other. They're not ever presented as these grey characters. It's always Helen got up and left her husband, or Menelaus was this mean king and she had to run away from him. Whereas your portrayal of those characters is so different, which I loved. It was so relatable because they are so different to each other that they just don't know how to communicate. And so I'm wondering why you chose that dynamic between them and to explore that thing where half the time they can't even speak to each other in your book because they're like, I'm just going to leave this in the room and then walk out.
I mean, partly it just felt more realistic to me. And it's sort of the stories that I'm interested in. There often isn't, you know, a good guy and a bad guy, or a good woman and a bad woman. You know, people are human. They have flaws, you know, and they're just trying to do the best that they can. So I was trying to imagine that relationship in a realistic way. And I mean, part of my reason for writing the book was to sort of rehabilitate Helen's reputation, to kind of vindicate her for the blame that's put on her, you know, for running away, for causing the war. But I didn't want to do that at the cost of Menelaus, because I also don't think that it's his fault, within the story. And this goes back to the original sources again. I don't think he ever comes across as a bad guy. He's not cruel, he's not vicious. I mean, when you compare him to Agamemnon as well, like I say, they're often, shown together. Agamemnon is 100% the stronger force, the more ambitious, the more violent. There's a moment in the Iliad where they're in the midst of the fighting, and someone begs for his life. One of the Trojans begs Menelaus not to kill him, but just to take him captive. And it says that, Menelaus's heart was softened, and he was going to lead him back to the camp and take him captive. And then Agamemnon's like, no, we're not taking anyone alive, just kill him. And Agamemnon just stabs him right there on the battlefield. And that just summarizes the difference between the two of them. Menelaus does have a soft side, even in those ancient sources. So I wanted to kind of draw that out. But at the same time, there's a reference in the Odyssey to how Menelaus is quite a serious person and also very short on words. He doesn't talk a lot, but what he does say has gravity. It's talking about the scene where him and Odysseus go at the very beginning of the war to try to negotiate for Helen. And it describes him in comparison to Odysseus, who is famously, a great talker. Menelaus is quite taciturn, and I just thought that was an interesting aspect of his character to bring out. What impact would that have on his relationship with Helen, and how could that lead to that relationship breaking down? So again, it goes right back to the sources, but I just wanted to pull out my own version of that narrative and see where it would go.
Now, one thing that does differ from the ancient sources in your retelling, which is fine, I know that everything I say sounds super, but I don't mean it to be. So you don't include the godly interventions, you don't include divine interventions. So there are moments on the battlefield that you describe where like Aphrodite would have come down to save Paris, and you don't have that in there, which is fine, it's totally fine. But I'm wondering why you chose to do that and leave out the supernatural element rather than throw it in there for just fun.
I think from the very beginning, I had the idea that I wanted to tell a historicized version of the war. And that meant making it historically realistic. I mean, I don't necessarily believe that these events happened or that these characters really existed, but I wanted to tell a story that could have happened and that these people could have existed and experienced it the way that I was describing it. So part of that to me meant taking away the supernatural elements as not being, part of a historical narrative. But it's also the types of stories that interest me in the novels that I read. I'm interested in human motivations primarily, and how, one little action from one character can have this ripple effect and affect, however many other people. So I always found it a more interesting challenge rather than, say, for example, in Iliad Book 3 that we were talking about, Aphrodite comes in at the end when Helen's kicking off about having to go to bed with Paris. Aphrodite basically says, well, I've set up this situation for you. If you're not happy with it, I'll abandon you, and then you can just suffer among the Trojans. So she sort of, forces Helen to sleep with Paris and to continue the sort of love affair. But wouldn't it be more interesting if instead of this kind of Deus Ex Machina moment, we think about what the real human feelings could be behind that dynamic, that she's in Troy, she's not a Trojan, but she's not a Greek anymore. She kind of hates her husband and she regrets all her choices, but at the same time, he's the only thing protecting her from the whole of Troy. He's one of her only allies there. So can she really spurn him, or does she have to keep sleeping with him and sort of keep up the pretense of the marriage? So to me, it's just a more interesting angle, but that's not to say that the gods and all the supernatural stuff isn't interesting too. It's just the way that I wanted to think about it.
Well, a god that you did include was, oh God, I'm going to say it wrong. Illithia? Is that her name?
It's definitely the hardest god to pronounce. I say like Illithia.
I've heard it pronounced so many different ways, and I listen to so many podcasts, and I know who they're saying every time. I'm like, well, obviously it's her, but everyone has decided it's said in different ways.
There's just so many vowels in there.
So many, so close together as well, that I'm like, help, someone, anyone. But you do mention her, regardless of how you pronounce it. I'll put it up on the screen for all the viewers that you can try and read it too. But you include her, and she is the goddess of childbirth, for those people who don't know. She's a minor minor goddess. She's a major goddess, but she's minor to most people. But she's a big part of your story. I have a couple of questions about her. The first one was, did you worry including that name that possibly people were going to just go,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a problem throughout, to be honest. Greek names are not the easiest, and it is a barrier to people that aren't familiar with them. You know, I mean, Clytemnestra is a handful. It's not just about Illithia. I mean, the names are one of the biggest barriers to people that aren't familiar with classics. I mean, I would hope that if things are unfamiliar, people might Google and just find out who that's referring to if they're interested. So it's sort of a platform to learn more, I suppose.
But also with Illithia, so sorry if there's any Greek person watching that's like, this is tragic. But with her, you have a controversial scene to classicists, probably not to anybody else. But you have this scene where Helen and Menelaus, basically Helen is actively trying not to have a child with Menelaus. So they go to this cave because he thinks that Illithia is not on their side. That he's like, this goddess must hate us, so we have to go to this cave and we have to do all these rites. And she's like, crap, okay, fine. So they do all the rites, and as they're leaving, she goes back in to kick this sacred stone to Illithia and spit on it. Now, this has been controversial amongst nerds because lots of people are like, wow, this is a really powerful scene to show how maybe she didn't even believe in the gods necessarily, or, you know, it's trying to stress the more mortal side of the story. And then other people are saying, well, Helen was probably scared crap. Like, I was about to say this, but like, she was probably scared like crap about the gods. So that this like wouldn't have been something that happened. So really, I just wanted to open up the floor to you to explain the scene, explain the purpose behind it, to sort of clear the air for all of the nerds that are arguing currently.
Yeah, I mean, on your kind of first side of the argument, I try to make it clear, I mean, from the very first prologue, that the gods are not necessarily actually taking any active role in what's happening. And there are obviously characters that 100% believe that the gods are influencing their lives, and they take that very seriously. They make prayers and vows, and those things directly influence their behavior. But with the character of Helen, I didn't see her as a particularly pious character. Compared to Clytemnestra, definitely, Clytemnestra has more of a serious belief in the gods, at least, you know, for parts of the novel. Really, that scene sort of came about quite organically. It just felt like something that character of Helen might do, because she's very impulsive. She's in a very strained situation where she's being forced to comply with a ritual to achieve the exact opposite of what she wants to achieve. And she feels completely powerless in that moment. And it is just her way of sort of rebelling against what's being forced on her. And she doesn't necessarily, she's not the most rational character. So I don't think that for her, she would think through the process of, oh, actually, it might not be such a good idea to annoy Illithia, because, you know, 5 years down the road, I might be in childbirth and really regretting this. She's a very in the moment type of person, and we see that throughout the novel. So her actions in the moment don't necessarily always marry up with the long-term consequences of what she expects, which again we see with the whole Paris scenario. So I thought that it just fit her character. And although there might be a wider culture there, you know, as you say, that's very much about utter respect for the gods and fear of what they might do in retribution, I don't think that an individual person's behavior is always in line with the culture that they're supposed to be a part of. And especially Helen, she is a transgressive character. She is famous because she didn't play by the rules. She wasn't normal. So yeah, it felt right for her, I think.
Keeping with Helen though, you include the episode where Theseus comes when she's a kid, which is oftentimes forgotten. I scream about it on the channel because I'm like, how can we forget that Theseus is just trash and has always been trash? But you include him coming. And what I like about this scene in your book, in Daughters of Sparta, is that it's more so the problem of rumor, regardless of what really happened, that there's going to be this rumor and it's going to affect Helen as she grows up, which ultimately leads to the suitor situation. So why did you think it was important to spin that story that way as opposed to get into the details and the nitty-gritty of what really happened?
Well, I'm interested by this idea of who controls the narrative. I mean, I think you have to be when you're, studying the ancient world, when you're any kind of historian, or even studying literature, who is telling the story, who gets to say what happened and what didn't. And overwhelmingly, that's men. So that's exactly what's happening in this first chapter. Something has happened between these two people. No one's there to witness it but the two people. And yet the man can go off and say whatever he wants and create the narrative that he wants to, and really the girl has no say in that. So that's one thing that I was playing with, but also in terms of how it compares to the original myth. In the original myth, I mean, as you know, it's much more dramatic. He comes to Sparta, he literally kidnaps her, takes her back to Athens. Her brothers have to go and rescue her. It's a whole adventure, and she's only like a child at the time. But rather than making it that whole extended sort of episode, I wanted to show that even just these really tiny, inconsequential incidents can have a huge impact, particularly on women. Historically, your reputation could be tainted by really nothing at all. And it's interesting in the ancient sources as well, that incident with Theseus, although we don't really hear very much about it now, ancient writers were aware of it. And it's just another thing that's used against Helen to prove that she's this wanton woman. And that in Ovid, who's a Roman poet, obviously, he wrote the Heroides, and one of those, they're sort of like imagined letters between people of mythology. So one of those is an imagined letter from Oenone to Paris, and Oenone was Paris's first wife, which we don't usually hear about. But Oenone says in that letter, trying to slag off Helen, basically, saying, I can't believe you've ditched me for this new woman. And she says, surely a woman that gets raped so much must be asking for it. That's essentially what she says. And that is an argument that gets used even now, that women must be courting this attention, that if bad things happen to them, it's because of something that they did. And we can see in that first chapter that that's not the case. Helen's a child, she does nothing, and yet her whole world and her family's sort of trajectory has to change because of what some boy says about her.
Yeah, it's crazy that you say that it's something that still happens, because that's a conversation that I have with a lot of other authors on this channel, that they're the same problems, they're just thrown into different situations, and that's what makes them so interesting to then re-explore and retell. Because it's, as you say, you have to be aware of the narrator, like who's controlling the story, and then how that story gets told. Because especially Helen, I found in the original, she was not slagged off at all. Like, it seemed like Homer actually kind of liked her. He was like, screw it, she's kind of funny.
Yeah, I think he's quite sympathetic towards Helen, definitely.
But another episode with Helen that I do want to talk about, because you have the suitors, and when they come, I was like, hello, I know all of you. This is amazing. So you have these like super famous characters that show up. You have Ajax, and I think, I said this in my email, that I think it's Idomeneus you referenced, but it was like, it could also be Meriones.
Yeah, there's a couple of Cretans, but yeah.
Because he's not by name, but I was like, okay, well, that one's
in my head it was Idomeneus, but it could be either.
Fab. I mean, no problem with Meriones. I bet you he's hot too, but that's fine. So you've got him, you've got Ajax, Diomedes rolls up, like they'll have their little foot races. Odysseus, he goes to talk to Helen's dad at one point. And one thing that I love about this scene, even though it's a very obviously male-oriented scene, is that you give Helen this agency in her choice. So not that she has complete choice, obviously. She can't just be like, well, I want that one. Her dad is very much like, here are your options, pick one. And she chooses Menelaus because she wants she wants the chance to possibly go and see Clytemnestra again. So I was wondering why you chose to give her even more so of a voice in this scene, when probably in the ancient times she wouldn't have had one.
I mean, like you say, it's not true agency. Really, the decision has been made, but she's kind of being asked out of courtesy, I suppose. It's more to explore what her feelings might have been about the potential options, the routes that her life might take from that point. And I think it's also quite illustrative of her character again. You know, throughout the first half of the book, there's a lot of moments where we see the types of thought process and the types of behavior that she goes through that might lead to future events. And really in that moment, you can see that she's really still a child. She's saying, well, if I get to marry Menelaus, then, you know, I'll be married to the brother of Clytemnestra's brother, and then we'll be more closely bonded, and maybe we'll get to visit each other, and it'll all be lovely, and I can still cling to the family that she's grown up with. She really just wants to stay in that world. She's not really thinking about being a wife and what that will entail. So I think, yeah, that's interesting and kind of showing her character, and also, like I say, her pattern of making quite an impulsive decision at the time based on theoretically the long-term consequences of that, but really the long-term consequences aren't realistic. She's a very hopeful, optimistic character. So she thinks, if I do this, I'll get to be happy. And yet we see again and again that doesn't really work for her. But she's always trying. She's always hoping for what will make her happy.
I mean, it's really cute, the dynamic that she has with Clytemnestra, because, I mean, it's something that we've never seen, but it's, as someone who has a sister, like, it's totally believable that I'm constantly like, okay, where can I meet you? Where can we do this? Like, how can we do this? You know? So it's like the fact that she's thinking that way of like, oh, maybe we could like spend Christmas together. Obviously not actual Christmas, but, you know, like that sort of mentality of like, well, I'm more likely to hang out with her, so we should definitely go this way. When, okay, controversial opinion on my part, but if you're going to choose a husband, it has to be Diomedes. Like, why are you choosing anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I thought from the way that they're described, she would be more likely to go towards Antilochus, probably, because he's kind of young and pretty, and he's the kind of image that she thinks is what's desirable in a husband, even though she doesn't really know any of these people. And in the end, you know, she says, oh, well, I would choose Menelaus, even though she's never even met him. She has no idea what he's like. But in her head, she's thinking, well, I don't really know any of these men, so I might as well choose the one that brings me closer to my sister. And it's quite sad, really, because we know, and it's clear that that's not true. It's not going to be the case. They're not going to be hanging out together. But she's always, like I say, she's always hoping for more. She's always hoping for happiness, even if she can't quite get it.
I mean, I think both of the sisters there, I found the way that you presented Clytemnestra was in that way as well, that she's always hoping that around the next corner, it's going to get a little bit better, with at least a little bit better. And it just, every time you turn the page, you're like, oh, damn, this woman has no idea. And one of the most famous scenes that she has to go through, which we briefly touched on, is the loss of her daughter, Iphigenia. And one thing I loved about this scene that you did, because it really felt like I was reading it again for the first time, which doesn't happen all that often, being a nerd. You're like, yes, I know how the scene goes, get through it. But you have Calchas, who, for those of you who don't know, he's the seer. He then says that Iphigenia has to be sacrificed because Artemis wants her to die and whatever, and that's why Agamemnon kills her. But you have Calchas, actually, he's held a grudge for so many years, and he wants to punish Agamemnon. And so he says this random prophecy thinking he'll never do it. He'll just understand what it feels like. And then he does it. And the pain that Clytemnestra feels, like when we find that out through Clytemnestra, I was like, oh my dear God, she is so calm compared to how I would be right now. So how did you come about writing that scene and deciding that that was what you wanted for Clytemnestra and for Calchas as well?
Well, again, this was something that happened really early on in my kind of concept of what the novel was going to be. Like I say, this was one of the points that I was imagining, the high points of the story. But in terms of Calchas's role in it, that was directly inspired by just a few lines in the Iliad. I mean, he's not a big character. He is in the Iliad. For anyone that's read it, you know, you'll be familiar with the name. He's the sort of nominated seer of the Greek army, so he kind of pops up to give prophecies and things, but he's not fleshed out. He's not given a backstory, but in book one of the Iliad, the setup for the story, for those that don't know, is essentially the Greek army is suffering from a plague, and they're trying to work out what they can do to stop it, and they consult Calchas the seer, and Calchas tells them that the reason that they're suffering from this plague is because Agamemnon has stolen the daughter of a priest, Chryses. So he's stolen this woman, Chryseis, and until he gives him back to Chryses, the plague won't end. And when Calchas announces that, Agamemnon calls him Seer of Evil, and he says, "You have never told me a good thing." And he's referring, of course, to in the past where Calchas told him this horrible prophecy that he had to sacrifice his daughter. And now he's telling Agamemnon that the reason that the Greek army is suffering is because of what have you done. And to solve it, you have to give away your prize. And Agamemnon is angry about that. But I always found that quite interesting, because if you're viewing these events in a world where the gods are real and Calchas is just a genuine priest, seer, he's got this message from the gods and he's just the bearer of bad news. You know, we can't blame Calchas for what he's prophesized. But if we take a different lens and we see this as a world where the gods are not genuinely interacting, they're not genuinely sending prophecies, then you have to wonder what Calchas's motivations are. That he's Agamemnon's seer, and yet he's always telling him bad news. Just so happens that he has to sacrifice his child and he has to give away his bride prize. You know, it just seems a little convenient that Calchas keeps telling him these terrible things. So that was really the jumping off point, and I thought maybe we can build in a whole backstory for how Calchas gets into this position of being the person, you know, whispering prophecies into his ear, and yet they're always bad. They always result in bad things for Agamemnon.
See, that is one of my favorite parts of the Iliad, because the way I picture it is just like poor Calchas like getting up to say this thing and being like, please don't look at me. And then literally Agamemnon's just like wagging his finger like, you, sir, have never told me anything I want to hear. And I love reading that, because I'm just like, I mean, yeah.
It always stuck with me, and yeah, that's why it influenced the character of Calchas in my novel, because I just always thought that was a great segment, and I thought it would be interesting to just imagine, you know, what could have led us there.
And Clytemnestra's reaction was like, it was my reaction, which is why I was like, dude, my reaction would have been way worse than hers. Like, she held it together so well. I was like, I probably would have killed the man. Like, would have killed him probably than Agamemnon, because he scares the crap out of me, even in literature. But she does end up doing that. So, spoiler, so sorry guys. If you haven't read it, if you haven't heard of this, Clytemnestra does brew for 10 years. She gets mad, brews about it, and then kills Agamemnon. But your book differed from the ancient sources in regards to her emotion into it. So the ancient sources are always that she was this like crazy, rage-filled woman, and you know, as soon as she got him in the tub, she stabbed him, and she had been having this raging affair and all of this. And your scene was so different to that. Your scene was very much that she had to go through the motions. She needed the comfort to do it. She needed the confidence to do it. She has Aegisthus there with her. And even when Aegisthus kills Cassandra, because Cassandra is Agamemnon's war prize. So when he does that, she even like screams and reacts to him, because she's like, whoa, we were just supposed to do one of them. We weren't supposed to do all of them. So was that again just to show sort of like a motherly reaction and sort of really diving into her character? Or were you just like, screw it, I actually just want to tell this really differently?
A bit of both. I mean, in terms of the motherly reaction, it definitely was that, but even more specifically than maybe you're imagining. I mean, I tried to deliberately draw visual parallels between the death of Cassandra and the death of Iphigenia, because Clytemnestra is still bearing trauma from that event, and then to see this other young girl who's just as innocent as her daughter be killed before her, I can't see that wouldn't be traumatic for her. So that's really where that aspect of the reaction came from. And in terms of my Clytemnestra versus the ancient sources, again, like Helen, I mean, part of the purpose of the novel really was to humanize these women that are painted as caricatures of infidelity, of violence, of transgressiveness in all sorts, and to just make her more human. And I just thought it'd be really interesting right from the beginning of her story to make her a girl or a woman that wants to be good. She wants to be exactly what she's supposed to be. She's extremely dutiful. She does everything that she's supposed to in terms of her family. She marries who they tell her to marry, even though she's not happy. She is a good mother. She does her duty as the queen of Mycenae. She does exactly what she's supposed to do. She's given him children, and she thinks, that must be enough. And yet she wasn't even able to keep hold of those children that she'd kind of risked so much to produce for her husband. So you can see why she would feel angry and betrayed, but also she's not an inherently violent person. She doesn't want to be murderous. She doesn't want to be forced to those extreme actions. And yet we see that she's in a position where she really doesn't have a choice. She has been completely pushed to the edge, despite always trying to do the right thing. Sometimes the right thing isn't an option, or there's no perfect path, and she kind of wrestles with that at the end, because she could not kill her husband, but then that has implications for Aegisthus, who she now loves, and for the child that they've had together. There's no solution where everyone is safe and happy. So she has to make a choice at the end there. And I just thought it was more complex and more interesting than a woman that is purely driven by vengeance and rage, which, is a story in itself, but that version of her has been told, multiple times. So this is just a different take, and sort of just accepting a few different sides to what might have been going on in her head.
My last official question for you is about sort of the undertones of the whole book, because I think that they really ring true to the undertones of the whole Trojan War. That a lot of people, I think modern people, not like everybody in general, I don't want to generalize, but I think a lot of people who haven't read the ancient sources do believe that this is a war caused by a woman. And there's so much more to this war. It's about like heroism, it's about glory, it's about what it means to be a man. Like it's more so about, in my opinion, that it's more so driven by like an object, that it's, oh, you took something that's mine, that could have been a vase for all they really cared. It's just about getting that thing back and making an example of it. And that's something that you have written in your book a bunch of times. It's said by multiple different characters, and it really is the undertone to make sure that it's not, people don't leave it blaming Helen, or they don't blame anybody else. So I was wondering if that was, again, something that you started off the book by saying, I'm making sure people know this, or was it just coming out because that's the story that we know?
Yeah, I think a bit of both. It was a conscious decision in terms of, as I say, I was trying to sort of vindicate Helen and remove some of the blame that she has had put upon her, in the last few thousand years. But also it's there in the original sources, like I say. I mean, Homer is very sympathetic towards Helen, and I don't think that he was particularly blaming her. Every time that the two, either the Greeks or the Trojans debate about, giving Helen back or whatever, they always say Helen and all the possessions that were stolen, or Helen and all her possessions. She is just one of those possessions. It's not really about her at all. And I think that is clear from that original text. And as you say, it's a lot more about men wanting to prove themselves, expand their sort of power and wealth. And again, in the Iliad, I mean, Agamemnon is never really talking about, oh, we must get Helen back. He's always saying, when do I get to sack Troy? That is his prize. That is what he wants. That's why he sailed there. And really, Helen and even his brother Menelaus are just a pretext for that. And that's something that I built into my novel as well, that we can see that Agamemnon is really using his own brother to start this war. He's only ever thinking about himself and what he's going to gain. He's not trying to help Menelaus or Helen or anyone else. He is one of the examples in the book of a character that is much less morally grey. I don't have much time for Agamemnon, and you'll see that from the novel, but he is certainly a selfish character, and it's all about what he's going to gain from the war, and I see him as the driving force behind it, really. So if you were going to pin it on anyone, it would be pinned on Agamemnon rather than Helen.
So thank you, Claire, so much for chatting with me today. If you guys have enjoyed this chat, then you can find all of Claire's socials in the description below. You can also find links to her book, links to my website, which has more links to her book, and all of that. So thank you so much again for sitting and chatting. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time with more videos here on Moan Inc. We'll see you then.